Welcome to the Space for Diplomacy podcast by Spaceport Sarabhai, India's space policy think tank. I'm your host, Susmita Mohanty. This podcast series features conversations on far-ranging topics such as geopolitics, tech diplomacy, international cooperation, and all things space. Today, I'll be speaking with Dr. Ranjana Kaul, who is joining me for this conversation from New Delhi. We hope to discuss, among other things, India's space law journey, satellite telecommunications and mega constellations, export controls, and space resource utilization. Ranjana, welcome to the Space for Diplomacy podcast.
Thank you, Susmita. Happy to be here.
Dr. Ranjana Kaul is a prominent Indian attorney specializing in international outer space law, national space policy, and satellite telecommunications. She currently practices at Dua Associates, one of India's leading law firms, and serves as Vice President of the International Institute of Space Law in Paris. Her expertise includes space security, commercial space advisory, and air accident claims. Globally recognized, she's a member of the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on Space Technologies and is a co-founder of the think tank Spaceport Sarabhai. She holds leadership roles in the Indian Space Association and the Satellite Industries Association of India. An experienced litigator, she represents clients in the Supreme Court of India and Delhi High Court, having served as government counsel for both the Union of India and Maharashtra. Her general practice covers company law, FTI, and dispute resolution. Ranjana received the IISL 2017 Distinguished Services Award and was named in the Forbes India Legal Power List of 2022. Ranjana, let's begin with the United Nations Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Can you tell our listeners when was it established? What's its purpose? And are there any challenges with this particular UN committee, given the volatile world that we live in?
Thank you, Susmita. That's an excellent question, actually, to start with. So, the reason why we need to understand COPUOS, the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, in context to activities in outer space, is because we know that space technologies are inherently dual use. It would stand to reason, therefore, what we call outer space, which includes the moon and celestial bodies as per the treaty, also hosts military as well as non-military, that is civil, and of course, dual-use systems. Now, in the United Nations, matters relating to disarmament, that means anything pertaining to nuclear WMD in outer space, and aspects relating to international security, and we are understanding this as per the UN Charter. Anything, any incident that might impugn international security and cause a crisis is discussed and determined in the United Nations First Committee on Disarmament and International Security. So that journey, as far as space law is concerned, or space activities is concerned, the starting point was 1957, when the Sputnik, which is the first human-made satellite, and it was a military communications satellite, that is when within weeks, from the 4th of October of 57 to 14th of November, the first space resolution was adopted in the UN First Committee on International Security, Disarmament, International Security. That process went on because all matters relating to military use of outer space and international security and disarmament are part of the narrative in the First Committee. Now you wanted a forum where the treaty could be negotiated and determined by the states independent of disarmament. And so in 1958, the Ad Hoc Committee on COPUOS was established and then formalized in 59. And that is where the treaty as we know it was negotiated. But in the parallel, everything that was happening in the First Committee relative to outer space is also to be found in the treaty, and you will find it in those, specifically in Article 4, Para 1 and 2. So these are the two sides of that same coin of activities in outer space. The COPUOS has two subcommittees, the legal subcommittee and the scientific and technical subcommittee. So the legal subcommittee is where all the legal regulations of how states are to be governed and what is the manner in which, for example, the term for peaceful purposes, which means that states will not conduct activities against another state in outer space. In short, the target cannot be in outer space. Whereas the scientific and technical subcommittee is on the operational side. What are the rules? What are the regulations? How is it to be launched? What are the procedures for filing and so forth? So both these go together. And that is the importance of the COPUOS. Throughout the 20th century, when the treaties were being negotiated, so say from 57 down to 79 are the binding treaties, the Moon Agreement included. Life was good. The two superpowers were looking at national level to achieve the same objectives, and it was all very good to be cooperating and getting on with whatever is required. And that's why we had the space treaties. And then other countries established military space programs. The 21st century is a whole different situation. There is big power contestation between three superpowers. They are military space superpowers. And in consequence of all that, there is no commonality, there is no consensus in the legal subcommittee. But there is consensus in the scientific and technical because, of course, everybody wants safety of space operations. But on the legal side, well, you don't want anything binding. You don't want anything to hold you down. And then when we see this rare instance of consensus, when the working group on the legal aspects of lunar space activities was established under Professor Freeland, then that was really, amazing that it happened. And last year in 2025, the draft report was submitted where those aspects, countries have to each give written submissions as to what their positions are. So this draft contains those aspects where there is a common understanding between states and those aspects where there isn't the common understanding. Now, the final report is going to be submitted next year in 2027. Assuming that there is some sort of consensus in that report, I really do not know whether there will be concessions to adopt that report, because different countries have different views on the matter. And let's see how that goes. And that is the importance, and the challenge is the absence of new legal regulatory frameworks that have not been forthcoming from the subcommittee. So this means that 21st century technologies, especially given the 5G non-terrestrial network framework, where, for example, the most important technology, I think, is rendezvous and proximity operations, which is a very versatile sort of, you can use it for anything from, refueling to debris removal to whatever else you wish to use it for. So this means that now you want countries to have deep domain knowledge of the space treaties that are applicable to them, which they have ratified, and then to work out exactly the legal aspects of how this RPO is to be governed.
On that note, Ranjana, I think I would like to bring you back to domestic matters. So India is a signatory to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, the 1972 Liability Convention, the 1979 Moon Agreement. And many of us in the space industry have been advocating for a national space law. The good news is there's finally been this parliamentary committee review recently of the space sector, where the committee also looked at the strategic and security implications of India's rapidly expanding commercial space sector. So given this recent review, I understand that the committee has asked the Department of Space to draft a space activities bill and send it to the legislature so that we can have a comprehensive legal framework that can replace our existing policy documents, vision statements, mission guidelines, what have you. So tell us, what do you see as the next steps in drafting this space law?
Well, space laws have two components. The first are the technical regulations. This is the eminent domain of the Department of Space, ISRO, and what InSpace and so forth are doing. That's on the operations side. And then there are the legal aspects, which are the legal regulatory framework, which is overarching. Now, as I explained to you in my previous answer, you would have understood, I think, figured out by now, so to speak, that there is a international technical regulator for space, which is the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee. Its counterpart in our country is ISRO, Department of Space. They're the ones who do that. And the legal regulators are in two forums. Everything pertaining to disarmament and international security is the Ministry of External Affairs, which represents the country in the first committee, and the Ministry of External Affairs, which also represents us in the legal subcommittee. So when your law has two aspects, and if you would see the MEA website, it tells you that international obligations are attendant upon the state, and they're not possible to delegate. And if there is a situation where commercial companies have to be delegated, it will only have to be through the national laws, which is under our constitutional provision. So, whereas, yes, we need that law, but the point is that you need the capacity to be able to interpret these 5 treaties. Now, we will not use the 5 because India has ratified 4 of them. In 1979, I think, we ratified the Rescue Agreement first. And then in 1982, the Outer Space Treaty, the Liability Convention, and the Registration Convention. So we got 4. What this means is, when you ratify, then those become legally binding upon you. Those are India's international obligations. And there is no way in which you can delegate those legal obligations. This means that you must have institutional capacity in those space treaties. These are interdependent, interconnected treaties, and you can't pick up one line or one provision and think that that's the solution. Outer Space Treaty doesn't give you all solutions. You need a huge corpus of institutional ability. Now, if MEA has that, we're good to go. Second aspect is our space department. It knows everything. In fact, we have a very robust presence in the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee. India has recently been chair of the long-term sustainability guidelines. Dr. Uma Maheswaran has been in chair. They know everything about operations, everything about procedures, filing information that is required, so forth, so forth. But unless Department of Space is saying that they do have institutional legal capacity in understanding and interpreting these treaties, then if they don't, there is a problem. If MEA says we don't, why doesn't Space Department have? But these two things are not coterminous. So I'm sure that they will find a way to resolve this. The other difficulty that I see as far as India is concerned is that we established a civil space program. That's right. That was a sovereign decision. And so this is what we do. But the point is that the Outer Space Treaty is the only international treaty that governs military activities, non-military or civil activities, and commercial activities under the authorization and supervision of the state. So there are many aspects of the treaty pertaining to military. That entire treaty, even if it doesn't use the word military excepting in para 2 of Article 4, is designed and built and agreed upon by military powers of the time of the 20th century. So Outer Space Treaty doesn't mean civil space activities, and neither does peaceful use of outer space mean civil space. It means not to conduct any activity against another state in outer space. That is what it means. So I'm sure we'll get there. I hope we will get there. Otherwise, we have a problem.
Staying in sort of the domestic realm, I mean, both of us know that the private sector in India is starting to expand, and happily so. So, can you also share with us what are the implications if a private satellite operator or a private rocket operator from India encounters a mishap involving a third party? Then what happens? Can you sort of give us can you build that scenario out for us?
Yes, well, first and foremost, let's talk about the satellite. If a launch vehicle ends up hitting another, and even if it, look, you don't need to be carrying TNT. In outer space, kinetic force is enough. So if your rocket goes and hits a satellite of another country, it would be construed as an anti-satellite test.
That is grave.
So you're completely not looking for such a situation. I don't even want to contemplate it, much less talk
That's sort of the
about
worst
such a
case
possibility.
scenario. Yeah.
No, not at all. So let's talk about the satellite. Now, if a satellite finds itself and there's an incident of collision in outer space, then you know that under the space treaty, the state is internationally liable for damage caused in outer space. So we'll only talk about outer space today, although it is also liable for damage caused in airspace and on the surface of the earth, but that's a different, we'll talk that another time. But here in outer space, it is fault-based liability. Now, as Indians, we are very familiar with law involving fault-based anything because we also follow common law. So did you exercise due diligence? Did you not exercise due diligence? Were you the claimant? Were you involved in contributory negligence? Can I, mitigate the quantum you're asking me for? Now, this entire situation requires first and foremost attribution. You have to attribute liability, and you have to attribute it in a definitive way. Now, you need to know your space treaties. A state that exercises jurisdiction and control over its satellite and is coterminously the state of registry and the launching state is the state that will be liable under Article 7, liability. Because these are obligations as between states, sovereign states, therefore, if you are a claimant against me and we are both commercial operators, or maybe you're a sovereign operator and I'm the commercial, you will establish a claim against me through the diplomatic channel, that is your Ministry of External Affairs or Foreign Ministry, which will come to our Foreign Ministry or our External Affairs Ministry. They will then send it to InSpace to say that, look, have we authorized and are you supervising this and what has happened and all those details. This is on the assumption that you are up to speed with this whole business of identifying precisely through the UN registries that India is the launching state and the state of registry. All good. Now I am on the opposite side. The question that then arises that I'm going to start wondering, I'll probably call up Digantara and say that, listen, can you tell me whether, contributory, let's say he's my service provider, SSA service provider. Can you tell me whether I can say that there was contributory negligence? I mean, you have a video of that, sort of impact in outer space. And what about all that debris? If they can give me technical evidence, very good. Back in the day, there was no technical evidence. So you're going to be saying, how many times did I try and, do collision avoidance maneuver? You have a live satellite. I have a live satellite. Did you respond to me or did you not respond to me? All of those things become important. And so the compensation and claims are always through diplomatic channels. Our commercial satellites are operating there and more of them are going to be operating. So when you're thinking of a space law for our country, what is the treatment that is going to be provided in the law? What are the actionable rights that our companies will have under our law in the matter of these claims, of whether you are defending that claim or challenging that claim or wanting to submit a claim because you sustain damage in outer space. That's one part. The other part is that internationally, as commercial space sector grew, countries realized that this, it's very tedious to go through your state. For commercial companies, why? Because there are geopolitical concerns.
Right.
You cannot take your lawyer, you will not be present. But quite apart from that, there's a geopolitics involved in the dynamics of the relationships between states. So the Permanent Court of Arbitration, the PAC optional rules for arbitration in for matters relating to outer space was adopted, including by India, in, I think this was 2011. So that means that if you and I, are, for example, are commercial companies and this is what has happened, rather than go through the states, we can perhaps both of us invoke that, agree to be subject to that process of international arbitration. But the fact is that I, as an Indian, require that actionable right to be granted to me by my state under the law. So my concern is that writing a space law is all fine, but every little bit of it has to be worked out thoroughly so that our companies have a robust law under which they can.
I think this highlights our earlier discussion around space law. I mean, India absolutely needs a space law sooner than later. We should have already had one. So let's talk a little bit about you mentioned the Ganthra in your last response. So now we are also starting to see companies that are providing space situational awareness and are helping with space traffic management. Earlier, there were these government bodies that were primarily responsible for sort of keeping track of our space environment. So can you tell us how are these private companies that are in the SSM and STM business interacting with earlier government bodies that were doing this for us?
So, Susmita, there are two things. One is what you're talking about, NORAD registry, SATCAT. First and foremost, when you think of supervision by the state, that state wants to know exactly where your satellite is. We continue to use the NORAD process where our commercial companies will have authorization to launch. And on the basis of that, they apply to NORAD. They give a what you might call a provisional number. You launch your satellite, it gets placed in the intended orbit and then goes live. And within a month of that launch, NORAD will give you a alphanumeric, it's a 9-digit alphanumeric indicator. That is required under our NGP to be provided to InSpace, who will then provide it to ISTRAC, I imagine, and then that supervision takes place. Now, that will remain. The second part is SSA. What is SSA doing? SSA is actually watching where that debris is or those active satellites are, and where are you, and if you are the client, then they're keeping focus on you and seeing where you are moving and what is around you. And if they reach the conclusion that there is a probability of a collision, they will inform you so that you can then prepare and undertake that collision maneuver, avoidance maneuver. When it is a case of debris, which is a defunct satellite, part of a satellite, or launch vehicle, parts of it which are floating around, millions of them, if it is a piece of trackable debris, and by which I mean that that piece of debris measures more than 10 centimeters, that is currently internationally the technological capability to track, to detect and to track along its predictable path that piece of debris relative to you. And then SSA provider will give you, that is space traffic management. So what does the SSA provider need? He also needs data, updated data of where those satellites are. because otherwise he's, at that velocity of 25,000 and a half kilometers at an hour. I mean, these are very fast moving. So you need databases, and there are databases. Not all companies update, at least the big companies are not updating and are not providing it to these databases that are used by SSA providers. Some of them have even said that you want to find out about us, please contact us.
Oh, that's
You can
complicated.
imagine at that velocity that we are going
Yeah.
to spend time contacting. So, these are very challenging things. And so that's where it is.
Yeah,
So
that's a
that's
very
as far as
serious
debris
matter.
is concerned. It is a very serious matter. And, the thing is this, Susmita, that when you're writing your space law, you need to have the legal and the technical people sitting together.
Absolutely. I think
Yeah,
for the
it's
sake
not
of our
possible
listeners,
to, do it in independent, it's just not possible.
indeed. So I think for the sake of our listeners, we should clarify that we have nearly 40,000 trackable debris objects larger than 10 centimeters in Earth orbit. We should also clarify that each of these debris objects is moving at enormous speeds, nearly 28,000 kilometers per hour. And if you think in miles, it's 17,500 miles per hour or so, which means every little piece of debris packs a punch. So I think this whole debris situation, Ranjana, is becoming more and more dangerous with as we sort of
So,
with
Sushmita,
this.
quite apart from trackable debris, by which you mean that you're able to precisely identify which country has international liability.
Oh
That
yeah,
is
absolutely.
that is the
That's
importance of trackable. But there are
trackable.
millions of pieces that are less than 10 centimeters.
Yes, I was looking at the European Space Agency's debris updates. It's like weather updates. And exactly like you said, there are millions. I mean, right down to less than a millimeter. So yes. Let's switch a little bit and talk about the moon because every country seems to be headed there. We recently had the Artemis 2 quartet, the astronauts, do a lunar flyby. In this century, we've had China has had 6 consecutive successful missions to the moon, of which they have also had 2 sample return missions where they have brought back lunar samples. India has had a successful landing near the lunar South Pole in August of 2023. So I think a couple of questions here. There's also the Artemis Accord, which is a US-led bilateral instrument which several countries have signed, including India. So what are the legal and diplomatic implications for the signatories of the Artemis Accords? Are there contradictions between the Artemis Accords and, let's say, the Moon Agreement and any other relevant international treaties? So can you lay out sort of the lunar governance landscape for us as it stands today? And what are your concerns in that regard?
Frankly, I have no concerns, but let me tell you what the concerns are. But firstly, also to say that Japan has landed on the moon as well, 1 month after us.
Oh, yes, that was a private company that did. Yes, yes, indeed.
So now the thing is this, that Artemis is, as per its own document, says that it is an arrangement. So between NASA and the signatory state or signatory space agency, based on political understanding pertaining to this civil sort of commercial activity in outer space. And to the extent possible will implement or not implement, has the desire to implement outer space treaty and other treaties. And this accord document, its genesis lies in an April 2020 executive order, presidential executive order, which stated that the United States does not regard outer space as a global common and that moon agreement is irrelevant.
This was during the Trump first term.
That is correct. Also, preceding this accord document, in 2018, the United States inaugurated the Artemis program of returning the first man and woman to the moon and further beyond. And that this Artemis Accord, the aim of the exercise was the direction given to NASA was to enlist international support in the furtherance of the Artemis program. And that is how countries signed up to it. And there are, I think, 62 or 63 countries that have signed up. Important thing to remember is that it is an arrangement based on political understanding. So each signatory signed differently, severally. So it's not a binding treaty. And that accord does not say in any which way that this is binding and that you may not do any other activity, your own national program or anything else. It doesn't say that. It also says, I think it's the last clause, that it will not be registered with the United Nations. That means any dispute or disagreement arising out of that, if such be, is not going to be subject to the jurisdiction of the United Nations, but as between the countries and with the US. So that's fine. So all these things, and this document will be submitted as the official document of the United States. So that is on one side. So there are no implications for you to pursue your own national program or do whatever. The other is the International Lunar Research Station, the Chinese and Russian endeavor. That model is based on an MOU. So you tell me what you can bring to the table and then we'll sign up accordingly, whatever. So it also allows technical institutions to be participants. So not only just sovereign states, but institutions. Now in all this, an interesting development is that Thailand and Senegal are the two countries that have signed up on both.
Very interesting indeed.
Yes, it's very interesting because in this day and age, unlike the 20th century, where Eastern Bloc, Western Bloc, all that, countries don't want to be in crosshairs. It's not worth it. Yeah? Everybody is looking to get forward with their economies and their people and all. They don't want unnecessary. If where you can avoid it, it's the best thing to avoid. The European countries have signed up. The EU itself has a project. I think ESA is got something that they're going to be contributing. I do not know today, though, what the status might be. Similarly, the Canadians have something on robotic arms. I don't know what the status on that will be. But equally, EU is continuing with its, ESA is continuing with its lunar program. It's a robotic lunar program, and they have three aspects to it. We are continuing with our own lunar program. We have a sample return mission now. Recently, by which I mean last year, to a question in Parliament on what is the progress on Artemis, the Minister of State for Space replied that we are not part of the Artemis program of 2018. And so if such occasion arises, we'll take it as it comes, but the emphasis continues to be on our national lunar program. So that is where it is. I don't think that there is any conflict. Needless to say that options are open for all countries to join both or for technical institutions to participate, but that's sovereign decision.
So I think from an engineering and design standpoint, the interoperability of systems becomes a very interesting thing to consider. From a legal standpoint, many of us are very curious as to what the legal subcommittee that Stephen Freeland is now heading will come out with, the report that's going to come out next year around resource extraction. That's a question on everybody's mind. So there are a handful of countries, Ranjana, who are signatories to the Moon Agreement and to the Artemis Accords. And from what you have just said, they might even be signing up with the Sino-Russian endeavor, which is the ILRS. So my question to you is fairly straightforward. The countries that have signed the Moon Agreement and Artemis Accords, for example, France, India, Australia are good examples. Australia has also ratified the Moon Agreement, unlike France and India that are signatories but haven't ratified it. And here is President Trump, who has extracted the United States out of the Moon Agreement with his executive order in his last term. So in such a situation, can India, being one of the major spacefaring nations, play a role in some form of multilateralism, given that it's a signatory to the Moon Agreement and to the Artemis Accords, rather than align with America's sort of unilateral approach to lunar governance? What are your thoughts on this matter?
Look, lunar governance is a very big word. It includes both the legal and technical aspects. Like I said, countries are generally inclined to cooperate and reach consensus on technical aspects. So let me tell you that as on date, the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, there is something called the Action Team on Lunar Activity Consultation, ATLAC, that has been established. And the aim of the exercise, that was last year, is to have a common understanding and consensus on scientific and technical aspects relating to landing sites coordination, lunar dust mitigation, cease lunar traffic, operationalizing Article 9 of the treaty. And this is very, very important because Article 9 of the treaty says you conduct whatever tests and missions and whatever it is that you wish to do, providing you are exercising due regard to the corresponding interest of other states. Now, this is a very powerful statement in context of lunar governance, whether it's technical or legal. Debris mitigation, there's bound to be, including in coordination with the Interagency Debris Mitigation Coordination Committee, and the protection of sites of significant scientific interest, which is not covered in Artemis, and lunar heritage. That's the first part. The second part, and an important part also, is the working group on the use of nuclear power sources in outer space. Now, you're going to need this to travel to the moon and beyond. You're going to need it to generate electricity over there. If you're expecting humans to be living, then you can imagine without nuclear. And so this is a very important, when you look at it involves safety framework. Every state will have to have that. And at the moment, they are gathering up information from states about what is their view on this working group. I mean, what are the suggestions? They're also talking to, they're not only talking to states. For example, I've had a sort of an interaction with Antonino Salameri. So he was doing this. He is apparently assisting them in some manner. Then on safety frameworks and what is India's view. And of course, India's view is it's a responsible space power. And it will most definitely do everything that is required to be done exactly in the manner prescribed in the UN resolution on the subject. So that is as far as lunar is concerned. As far as your question on governance, as I said, on the legal side, well, firstly, there are 17 ratifying states. But here is the thing, Susmita. The Moon Agreement is a UN treaty, which is an existing treaty and an operational treaty. And that has come about because of consensus in the legal subcommittee, and this includes the United States. The second step, after a treaty comes into force, there are a minimum number of countries that are indicated in that treaty that must ratify, then it comes into force. So Moon Agreement is a treaty in force. It is left to each country then to decide whether it wishes to be regulated under that treaty or not, which is not to say that you have rejected it in any form and manner. That is not true. But what you have said is that as far as I'm concerned, it's irrelevant. Now, when Australia submitted it's the country that was one of the early ratifying states, it said that it does not see any conflict in it being a signatory to the Artemis and in having ratified the Moon Agreement. This is similarly the case with other countries. We are signatories. France is a signatory. What this means is that if there should be a problem on the moon, we are not in a, with the ratifying states, with the 17 states, we are not in a position to invoke the moon agreement against the other. But because we're signatories, we would be expected under international law, principles of international law, to comply with it in good faith. That is the thing. Well, you had asked me another question on this, and will you repeat that for me, please?
No, I think my collateral, sort of the corollary was, can India play a role in ensuring that multilateralism is still the way forward, rather than unilateral moves being made by certain powers, such as, the executive order where Trump withdrew his country from the Moon Agreement and also clearly stated that they don't believe the space to be a global commons.
No, Susmita, one action is a national action, and every nation decides its sovereign priorities. So the United States has decided, and in 2015, they already enacted a law granting their citizens rights to extract commercial exploitation of lunar, not lunar, but space resources. And in furtherance of that, you then have the Artemis program, and then you have the Artemis Accord, and an executive order that says that moon agreement is irrelevant. US cannot destabilize the moon agreement. On the other side is cooperation amongst countries, multilateralism, which is what is happening in the UN. So that will succeed based on consensus. So I've told you the difference between how legal subcommittee and scientific and technical subcommittee. So will India play a role or not? I do not know. I do not know what India's official position is on lunar resource extraction, because we did not submit anything to the legal subcommittee, to the working group. So I can't say what India's official position is, but you can understand the official position from the reply that the minister gave in the parliament regarding Artemis. And second of all, our Indian space policy that is telling us that quite clearly we're getting on with our own lunar program. But lunar resources, I do not know. There is no conflict between the Moon Agreement and the Outer Space Treaty. Every bit of that Moon Agreement amplifies the Outer Space Treaty. The only difference that there is, because the Moon Agreement doesn't deal with it, but it doesn't prevent it either, is that the Moon Agreement says that when these resources are to be commercially exploited and when it becomes viable, then the states must establish an international regulatory mechanism for the management of these resources and for the equitable distribution of those resources, keeping in mind especially the contributions by those states that have, but also of developing countries. Now, the word equitable has been misconstrued to mean a mathematical equitable, one for you, one for me. But the word equality, equitable, derives from the United Nations Charter, Article 2, sovereign equality of nations. And you find that in Article 1, on the basis of equality without discrimination, right? Access to space. So the point of the matter is this, that each country will pursue its own national objective. And we have to, all countries must navigate in and around those positions.
Right. Let's talk about the militarization and weaponization of outer space. In recent years, we are starting to see countries that didn't have a space defense component. They too have started to establish, their own little space force, so to speak. The United States has, in recent years, announced the plan to create a golden dome, which To my understanding, they are also going to have space-based interceptors, which sounds very expensive and technically challenging, but I think that's what they have said. Australia has announced a space force. India set up a defense space agency. Can you share your views on where we are headed as a planet in terms of space being weaponized? And do we have adequate norms around preventing the weaponization of space as was envisioned in the early years during the Cold War? I mean, is it a different scenario now if you think about it? And what are the guardrails and what are the checks and balances that we have in our treaties?
Well, during the Cold War, I said that there was incredible kind of cooperation between the two adversaries for space. As we know from our own history, that in simultaneously time, they were waging terrestrial armed conflict, dividing the world into the Eastern and Western blocks. But because there was, as it happened, objectives were similar for space, you never heard about space. Nobody knew what was happening in space. All of these countries, the United States and the Soviet Union already in 1945, immediately after the end of the war, China in 1949, and so on and on and on. And I will say it until 72 because India established in 72. Every country established a military space program. That did not prevent them from doing non-military. You have the experience of our own commercial companies. Do you think that just because they're going to end up doing dual-use technology platforms, that as a starting point, they're going to be taking potshots at some other country's satellites? No. You're going to use your own satellite to test, like we did our anti-satellite test, like China did, like between 1963 and 85, the US and the Soviet Union did. They were not shooting each other down. Of course not. They were testing to develop and validate their technology. Has it ever been used? No. Will it be used? No, is my understanding. Because it will create debris. And that is the biggest thing. 21st century is non-kinetic offensive. That is where we are headed to. So for the 21st century, when we're talking of weaponization of space, after that first 1957 resolution, technologies started, naturally, they were both developing technologies. So by 63, the 57 resolution is the one that came up with these two unique phrases. It's uniquely applicable only to outer space. Exclusively for peaceful purpose, which means it's a euphemism for prohibition on nuclear and WMDs in outer space. In 57, it was a case that it was not to be transported through space, which is to say that you cannot use the trajectory. The fear they had was nuclear missile attacks. Remember that in 45, there had already been nuclear missile attacks on a particular country. And that was about the last thing that either of these two were looking for. So that was established, and then the term for peaceful purposes. You will not conduct activities against any other state in outer space. Now by 63, also surveillance satellites were recognized as the national technical means of surveillance, validation, and that they would be peaceful purposes. You're not impinging upon anybody else's sovereignty, because if you're on top. By 63, both the superpowers had developed their space domain awareness and ISR capabilities to such an extent that they knew exactly who's doing what. They could see it from space. So there's a resolution of 1963 where both states jointly submitted to the UN First Committee to say that we do not propose putting nuclear and WMDs around the orbit of the Earth. So from the 57 prohibition on using the trajectory through, you have now denuclearized the Earth orbit, which you will find in Article 4, Para 1. But the moon and celestial bodies or any other place in outer space, whether it's void space or anywhere else in space, no WMDs. and the moon and planets exclusively for peaceful purpose. Disarmament, complete disarmament. And that is why this working group on the use of nuclear power sources becomes so important. So that's one part. Now you find that right through to 72, excepting for Japan and India, all other countries had established military space programs. Japan and India established civil space, non-military program. In 2008, Japan, recognizing national security implications, announced publicly that it is establishing a military space program in addition to its existing civil and commercial verticals. India still has, at official level, a civil space program. And so for us, the peaceful use of outer space means civil space activities for India. Now, as you have pointed out, we have also decided on military, and we are seeing a very active engagement in that aspect. The problem is we need to have institutional clarity. The Outer Space Treaty governs all activity. There is no other international law that governs military space activities. You need that domain knowledge to be able to take appropriate decisions. Most importantly also, per se, but most importantly also, because where we have seen in the recent past, in the Ukraine war, Starlinks and a couple of other US commercial companies, also a European company, directly participating, providing support to the Ukrainian armed forces. They're not doing it on their own because they felt like doing it. They are doing it under the authorization and supervision of their states. Of that, there is no doubt. Now, in consequence of all this, the Ukrainians were able to sink the Russian flagship Moskova in the Black Sea. When that happened, for the first time, for the very first time, since the treaty was established, the Russian delegation raised this subject in the UN First Committee, not as a specific agenda item, but in course of general discussions on outer space. And the sum and substance of that was that the Western states are looking to use their quasi-infrastructure. Why quasi? Because it's through national law, it's not a sovereign asset. And that those could be construed as legitimate targets. This is Article 51 of the UN Charter. Self-defense.
So
it's not
essentially
against...
Starlink, which began as a commercial network, given its role
your
in recent
commercial
conflicts,
satellites
right,
are vulnerable.
So it does make Starlink a legitimate military target then.
So the point is that when we are thinking, under the leadership of Pixel, there is a proposal for those satellites, which are going to be dual use. We have to understand these aspects. Our space law must be extremely carefully drafted. You cannot squeeze military aspects through a civil space institutional construct. That will cause very great difficulty for our military users. And the aim of the exercise is to be sure that your users are going to continue with space activities for peaceful purposes. It's very, very crucial and important for us. We are at a very delicate state, and we need all hands on decks at institutional level.
Yeah, that brings us full circle, Ranjana. The final question is a bit speculative. Let's project the future. Let's look ahead to, say, 2050. If you could design one new international legal instrument for outer space from scratch, a treaty, a framework, a law, today, now, what would it be and why is it most urgent?
Well, Susmita, it is truly a speculative question. Because the starting point is that, am I writing it as Ranjana Kaul, private citizen of India, and my speculation, or am I looking at it as the realist Ranjana, who's saying that, well, Where is an international forum where everyone can meet and agree? I don't see any signs of consensus on the legal side. So I really shudder to think what it. I won't be around, by the way. So after me, the deluge. But no. But on a serious note, it is impossible to come up with any solution, excepting to say that in 2050, I want freedom of access to space. I want all countries, depending on whatever their various capabilities may or may not be able to safely access space and use space, to have not only orbital possibilities, but also spectrum, and all of the things that are available today, but under stress. Now, if you can tell me that, okay, you design something for 50 with all the good things that you want out of that space treaty, and then on the top of that, then I have nothing more, if all the good things are there.
Thank you, Ranjana. You've left us here on a worrying note, but also on something that we all need to think about. Thanks for taking your time. It was a pleasure talking to you, Ranjana.
Thank you, Susmita.
Thank you all for listening. Stay tuned for our next episode. Refer to our website, spaceportsarabhai.org, for more discussions, debates, dialogues, an explainer series, the new Space India podcast, and a newsletter about the progress of India's space program.